Welcome everyone to our latest Food Safety for Farmers webinar. This is part of our food safety series, and today we'll be talking about preventive controls for human food rule. And we're very happy to be joined once again by Dr. Keith Schneider and Dr. Michelle Danyluk, both professors in the Food Science and Human Nutrition Department at the University of Florida. Welcome, Keith and Michelle, again.
Morning, JC.
Great to be here. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you guys again, and we really appreciate all of the valuable information you've provided as part of our project. This webinar series is supported by a grant from the Food Safety Outreach Program from the USA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And the contents of the webinar is solely the responsibility of Florida organic growers who have developed these materials, and does not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA. Please, for more information, you can visit the FDA's website, where you'll find information on the Food Safety Modernization Act regulations. So with that, we would like to talk a little bit about what it is that we'll be covering during today's webinar. We are speaking once again about the preventive controls for human food rule and the concepts that are part of that specific rule. In previous podcasts, we have been discussing good agricultural practices, gaps, hazard analysis and critical control points, HACCP, and of course the preventive controls for human food rule. And we'll be discussing these topics a little bit further and see how they're related and what they all mean for farmers. And I guess we could maybe begin by defining once again or reminding people what good agricultural practices are. So Michelle and Keith, maybe you can tell us or remind us once again what we understand by good agricultural practices. What really do we mean when we're talking about gaps?
Yeah, I'll start with a little bit of history, and Michelle can go into some specifics. Back in the late 90s, 1998, 1999, a document was produced sort of pulling together some basically good agricultural practices. And they were written down, and they gave a group of voluntary things that farmers could do to produce safer agricultural products. There was a rise or corresponding rise in the number of foodborne illnesses associated with produce as we became, or the society wanted to move to a more healthier lifestyle and eat more produce. What ended up happening was there was a proportional increase in the number of foodborne illnesses associated with produce. And the folks up at FDA, USDA got together and jointly and came up with a group of things that could be done that could ensure that the produce that was being produced would be safer for the consumers.
Yeah, and so that has continued through today through a number of different auditing schemes that are available out there that a grower can go through to meet the different buyer requirements that they may have. And so successful completion of one of those different audit schemes results in GAP certification for a grower and is typically grants them market access into different retail chains. So I think overall they've been very successful over the last 20 plus years.
And those sort of practices include things like training workers, personal hygiene, the water use within the field. So these were voluntary things that, again, most people were doing anyway, but they sort of put them all in one sort of handy dandy guidance, and that became, like I said. So yeah, some of the basic tenets most farmers are already doing, but GAPs cover things like worker training, personal hygiene, proper use of water, pre and post harvest. So these are just some basic things that have been around as a voluntary program for about 30 years now.
Great. Well, thank you for clarifying that for us. And then we also have discussed the hazard analysis and critical control point HACCP. And perhaps we can also now take a minute or two to remind people what those are and what they mean.
Yeah, for sure. So HACCP was a program that started back in the 1960s with the space program to really look at proactive ways of preventing the astronauts who are headed up to space to get sick. And it expanded sort of throughout the food industry, slowly really sort of peaking in interest in the late 80s. And then really we saw HACCP move into the workforce or the food industry in the 90s, and some regulations in the 90s and early 2000s around HACCP. We see it a fair amount for different products. And we've seen it used quite a bit on different farms and in different packing houses, again, driven by bio requirements and audit standards, not so federal regulations.
Yeah, it originally, again, when it was adopted, HACCP was only mandatory for meat and poultry, seafood, and juice products. Everybody else, it was a voluntary program. And despite being voluntary, a lot of, I guess due to buyer pressure, a lot of companies adopted HACCP as a way of producing safe food. And this, again, was a really systematic program, as Michelle mentioned, developed for the space program so people wouldn't get food poisoning in those tiny little capsules where they didn't have much chance of going to the corner drugstore. And in this case, again, really what it did was it broke down all the steps of processing, looked for those weak links in the chain. And if you were able to control those weak links, you could produce safe food, and you really wouldn't even have to test the product. It was revolutionary. It seems simple now, but at the time it was a very revolutionary way of thinking about the manufacturing of food.
And it when we look at, and as we transition into talking about the FSMA rules, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, the FSMA rules sort of build upon what we've known and been doing in HACCP. And like he said, the HACCP process very much focuses on the process. It looks very much at unit operations and production steps you do, and how do you make the process safer. And I think sort of as we looked moving forward into preventive controls and move forward, what we were able to do is take a retrospective look back at 20 years worth of HACCP programs and see where the programs often failed the most frequently. And what we found is that it wasn't always a failure in that process, that we were regulating so well through these HACCP systems and taking such a proactive approach about. Where we saw some of the failures happening that led to outbreaks or led to recalls had to do with things that were peripheral to HACCP, or what we would have called a prerequisite program in a HACCP-based system. And what FSMA and really as we moved into preventive controls did was take those prerequisite programs that were failing and leading to food safety issues, and elevated them to the same status that we talked about critical control points in the process in HACCP. So it's a really, I think, pretty seamless evolution from this HACCP-based system into the new rule we're here today to talk about. That's preventive controls.
Mm-hmm. So and that's a great lead into the main focus of our webinar, which is, preventive controls for human food. And as you mentioned, how HACCP and GAP, as we've discussed, really have helped, right? From my understanding in the development of the preventive controls for human food rule. So can you elaborate a little bit more then on preventive controls and what really our farmers need to know?
Sure, I'll start off. Preventive controls for human food is really just one part of the Food Safety Modernization Act. We've talked about the produce safety rule, which is really sort of an advanced GAPS program. There's preventive controls for animal feed. So there's a whole bunch of these rules that are all embedded within the overarching Food Safety Modernization Act. This rule takes that voluntary program of HACCP and makes it mandatory for all food processors that fall within the regulation. And as Michelle implied there, is that HACCP is really built off the basic tenets of HACCP. This is where you do a hazard analysis, and then we go and look at those critical control points, or those points within the process that, again, where a failure can occur. We often joke that preventive controls is HACCP on steroids. We look at it and go, we had HACCP, it worked really well, but there were certain points within the system where it failed, or it didn't do as good a job as we'd like. And then when the regulators went in, they looked at those points where they thought they could do better, and they created preventive controls. Now, if you've taken both courses, or if you've read about these two things, you'd say that they're really similar in a lot of ways, except preventive controls goes a little bit further. There are certain areas where sanitation gets bumped up, where allergen control gets bumped up. We're thinking more about the supply chain now. So when we look at the two systems, they're really, other than a couple of different name changes of what we call different things within the training programs, they basically operate the same way. And all we're doing now is we're putting added emphasis on those things like allergens and sanitation and supply chain. This way we can hopefully reduce the number of recalls and outbreaks that have still been occurring, even though HACCP systems have been in place.
Yeah, and one of the ways, JC, they're really similar is that one of the first steps of each of them is to do a hazard analysis, which is where you go through a really systemic process where you look at all the ingredients coming into your food. You look at all the steps that food goes through from the time it arrives at your facility to the time you put it in a truck leaving your facility, and you identify at each one of those steps, can I introduce, can I control, can I prevent hazards from entering the system? And so when we talk in gaps a lot, and less so in gaps, but especially in the produce safety rule, our focus is really on biological hazards, right? We're worried about the pathogens. And one of the things that preventive controls does is it's not just those biological hazards like the different bacteria. It also is chemical hazards like the allergens that Keith was talking about, or toxins, or unwanted chemicals from an improper sanitizer. It also looks at physical hazards, so things like rocks and sticks and stones. It even also encourages looking at radiological hazards. Are you producing food from an area that's got known radiation in it? So it really takes it to not just systemically looking at where you can introduce and control hazards, but also what those hazards are, and then what you can do to control them. And like Keith has mentioned, it's not just the critical control points that we found in HACCP, but we also see allergen controls, which can be things like doing an allergen clean. If you've got one of the big 8, or I guess soon to be big 9, when we add sesame later this year, allergens in your facility, how are you going to make sure that those don't cross contact other products? It looks at sanitation. And if you look at that third bullet point down, that is really what we're worried about. And I think that there are a number of different examples in a produce that where we can see that the environment that food was being packed was a source of one of these foodborne hazards. And I think the example Keith and I point to most frequently is that the cantaloupe outbreak back in 2011 with Listeria at Jensen Farms, where really that processing equipment was the source of Listeria. And so one of the things that really has emerged in the preventive control rule is these sanitation controls. Anytime you have a food that is contacting a food contact surface before it goes in its final packaging, You need to make sure you have controls in place for listeria if you've got a sort of a wet facility, or for salmonella if you've got some sort of a low moisture or dried food or dried packing environment. So those sanitation controls have become really high on the list. Also high on the list are what they call supply chain controls. And again, historically, people would have done this through a supplier program and would have called it a prerequisite program from HACCP. But now, if you are bringing in something that could contain a pathogen and somebody upstream of you controls it, you need to identify that and verify they're doing something to control it. Likewise, if you're sending out a product where somebody after you in the food chain will be controlling the hazard for you, then you need to clearly identify that the product you're shipping them has not yet had that hazard controlled. So those are supply chain controls, and all of these different controls, like Keith has mentioned, and I think I mentioned, are really based on areas where we had previously seen breakdowns in a HACCP-based system. And I think allergen labeling is the biggest one. If you look at recalls sort of over the last decade or so, improper labeling of allergens is the leading cause of recalls within the food system.
Mm-hmm. And just to summarize, Michelle, and we'll now begin discussing a little bit further, more in depth with those, what that really is and what it establishes.
Yeah, I'll talk on that first bullet point, and then I'll let Keith sort of talk below me.
Okay.
So a farm is defined not in the produce safety rule, but it's defined within the preventive control rule. And the preventive control rule covers different types of farming operations. And so anyone who's defined as a farm is not subject to the preventive control rule. Now, this is a piece of that regulation that is under something called enforcement discretion, because the way the farm definition is written now is that not all packing houses will meet the definition of a farm. And so this is something to watch in the future to see sort of where a packing house might fall. Right now, they define two types of farms. They define a primary activities farm and a secondary activities farm. Primary activities farm is a pretty straightforward definition. If you are growing product and you are packing product on that same physical location where you are growing the product, that packing house is part of your farm, covered by the produce safety rule, not covered by the preventive control rule. I think what we see, especially on some of the bigger operations, is that their packing houses are not co-located physically with where they're growing the product. And in some areas where the packing houses might be older and the city has creeped up around them, you might actually, see those packing houses in the middle of what used to be agricultural land and now is a city. And those facilities that aren't located on the land where you're also growing the crop might meet the definition of what's called a secondary activities farm. And so a secondary activities farm, as is currently defined in the rule, is a packing operation or an off-farm operation that is owned by the farm and that packs more than 50% by volume produce that is grown on that farm. So it's a really complicated definition. And if you meet that definition of a secondary activities farm, you're also not covered by the preventive control rule. But if you are a packing house that is not owned by the farmer and a packing house that packs products more than 50% by volume that you haven't grown yourself, then you would not meet the definition of a farm and you'd be covered under the preventive control rule. And like I said, it is very complicated, and it's something that FDA realizes is very complicated, and they have promised us for years more guidance, better definitions. Their goal is to move all packing operations into the produce safety rule as written now. That's not the case in all operations, and certainly, the corporate structures of especially large packing houses can be complicated. And each situation is a little bit different. But again, the goal is to move all packing houses into the produce safety rule, or at least that's what's been told to us. But know that this definition of a farm is really confusing. There's not an easy way to answer it. But if you have questions, I'd say reach out to someone where we can talk through your specific example, knowing that the definition is still subject to change, or we've been told that it's subject to change.
So in terms of that, what would you recommend, and how can the people listening to this webinar do if they do have questions or want to find out if there's going to be changes or some of the things that you're discussing? Where can they go to find that information? Who should they contact?
Well, the first thing I would suggest is keep calm and don't panic. The vast majority of the folks who are listening to this are going to be considered farms, and the preventive control rule is going to be for somebody else. If they do, though, if they're kind of on the fence, and they think they might actually be a processor or one of these secondary operations that Michelle is talking about, one of the easiest ways is going to the FDA website, and they have a couple of really good fact sheets that we could probably link in the show notes that will take them to a site that will give them a decision tree that they can kind of walk through. As Michelle has pointed at, is sometimes while this decision tree has nice bright colors and big arrows, it's not as easily, there's a lot of caveats. It's not as easily followed to get to the endpoint. And if that's the point where if they go to the website, look at the decision tree, and they still have questions, they can kind of reach out to Michelle or I or other extension agents who deal with this, and we can try to help them walk through. Because again, sometimes, for the most part, the vast majority of these operations are going to be considered farms. But if you're not sure, again, go to the FDA website, look at those decision trees, and if you're still not sure, you can kind of reach out to one of us, and we can try to walk you through it.
Yeah, and just for everyone listening, we are providing Keith's and Michelle's contact information on our webinar today. So please feel free to contact them when you have questions. Visit the website as Keith has indicated, and Michelle as well, because there are going to be, as you both have been saying, a lot of things that perhaps are confusing and that are going to require, sort of more discussion or information. So.
Yeah, and I think I'll just follow up to say that while somebody might not be covered under the preventive control rule by FDA, we have seen language around packing houses that wouldn't be considered a farm, or that would be considered a farm by FDA. Their audit schemes are still asking them to do some preventive controls on their operation. So I think growers need to be aware too of what their buyers are asking them to do and what their audit schemes are asking them to do. Certainly we don't, I don't want to say we'd rather they not do preventive controls, but preventive controls is, like he said, it's HACCP on steroids. It's a complicated program that a lot of farms and packing houses, it really is probably more than they need on their operations. And while we're glad to help, we also want to make sure that they're not spending their time doing something that they don't need to do.
Right.
And they should, and hopefully are probably fall under the umbrella of the produce safety rule, and we'd rather have them implement that properly rather than try to overdo it with preventive controls.
Great.
One other point on the bottom, your last bullet point, JC, good manufacturing practices. If you're wondering what that C stands for, that's current, and they haven't always been current. They've been around for about 60 years, and really early on, before HACCP even became a thing, there was a list of things, good manufacturing practices, those common sense things that manufacturers were supposed to do. And these came out again about 60 years ago, and they've been updated as the food regulations have been updated. One of the biggest updates was back in, I think, 1986. And again, they were considered current, and they're really a prerequisite program now. Before, that's all we had to sort of work with. Once HACCP became more established and other food safety programs became established, the good manufacturing practices became a prerequisite program. These were the minimal things you need to have before you could even get started. And with the introduction of the preventive control rule for human foods, the good manufacturing practices were updated and they were added to the PC rule. And again, for the folks who like legalese out there, the 21 CFR 110, which is the Code of Federal Regulations, 21st volume, part 110, they shifted the good manufacturing practices to the 21 CFR 117. So if anybody just Googles 21 CFR 117, not only will you find good manufacturing practices, but you'll find the entire preventive control rule. And that's where this has been codified. They are more current now because this update was just done a couple of years ago. But these are the prerequisites that you need if you have to run the preventive controls rule. That, again, things like you have to start with clean water. And that seems sort of like common sense, but yeah, this means you have to make sure that the water they're using is clean. So those are the prerequisites you need to have. And once all the prerequisites are in place, then you can build your program, the preventive controls, on top of that foundation of those good manufacturing practices. But if anybody's interested, just kind of use your favorite search engine and 21 CFR 117, and you'll find that.
Okay. Thank you for pointing that out. That takes us to actually a question that we get often, which is, where can I find the major requirements under the final preventive controls for human food rule?
Yeah, and so I think on the next slide, we linked to that fact sheet that Keith talked to a little bit earlier. FDA has put out a fact sheet. It is still 6 pages long, so it is not a simple fact sheet, but the rule is not simple. But that fact sheet really does talk through a series of questions that you may have about the rule. And so it includes things like, does this rule apply to me, right? And that goes through some of the things that Keith and I talked about simply. Do those GMPs that Keith just mentioned, those CGMPs, do they apply to me? It talks about compliance states, although we've passed most of the compliance states now. And then again, what are the rules? What are the hazards? What do I do if I have a hazard? And then it also talks through some of the resources FDA has, including an online plan builder to help people develop these produce safety plans. And so I'll say that one of the biggest differences between the preventive control rule and there's a lot of differences between the preventive control rule and produce safety rule, but a couple of the big ones are the preventive control rule requires you have a written food safety plan, right? One of the things about the produce safety rule is there's no required written food safety plan. And the preventive control rule does require a written food safety plan. And that written plan has to include a hazard analysis. It has to look at what preventive controls are appropriate. You then need to define within those preventive controls how you are going to manage and control them in your operations. And then it also requires a mandatory recall plan. So there is this written required preventive control food safety plan. Another big difference is that produce safety rule, right, has a required grower training. Everybody needs to go to the training that's been approved by FDA as adequate. Interestingly, in preventive controls, there is a curricula available for people to take to become what's called a preventive controls qualified individual, or a PCQI. And while every operation needs a PCQI, a person doesn't have to necessarily take the training to become a PCQI. So there's no mandatory training for the preventive control rule like there is for the produce safety rule, which I've always found that really interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this written plan, as you've described it, and I think it's maybe related. Another question is, what records do I need to keep for the preventive controls for human food rule. So the written plan is one thing. The records that have to be, things that these producers must have as part of that written plan, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to talk
So
about records, Keith? All of them. The answer is, what records do you need?
lots.
Lots.
So
Okay.
I'll give you. I'm going to give you a 3-day course in about 30 seconds here.
Okay.
The first thing that you do is you do that hazard analysis that Michelle mentioned. Then you identify all the preventive controls that you're going to need to produce safe food. You establish limits that you're going to monitor, things like frequency, how are you going to do it, who's going to do it. And at that point, we then figure out, all right, once we have all that in place, what are we going to do? What are the corrective actions when things go wrong? We're going to figure out how we're going to verify all these things are functioning properly, and everything that we've identified, all those steps, all the monitoring, all the verification steps, all the corrective actions, all of those are going to be kept. Those are the records you're going to need. So every point within the system where we identify a preventive control at a processing step, sanitation, allergen, or supply chain, and every one of those steps we're performing some activity, those are all going to be part of the records that I'm going to need to keep. So when you go through the course or go through the training, what you'll see is as you're building this plan that Michelle talked about, each one of those is going to have what records do I need to keep, and they are copious. The more complex the process, the more records you're going to have. They don't have to be difficult. They could be something simple as a clipboard. They could be electronic. But again, everything that you do, you want to have some way to prove that you actually done the step that you've identified in the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the produce safety rule, we're pretty quickly able to come to a document that's less than 5 or 6 pages where we detail these are the written records required. Like he said, with these preventive control plans, we can't have that simple document because the records you keep are so dependent on the process you have. But required records, include things like calibration and calibration logs of different monitoring devices. They can include sanitation SOPs and master sanitation schedules. They're going to include the corrective actions you do when something goes wrong. So it's a lot more records that are required, again, to prove the plan is working, and then to validate that the things that you're required in the plan to do are appropriate. It's an awful lot more records. And I wish we could give you a simple answer here, but it's not a simple. I mean, like we said, this whole rule is not simple.
Yeah.
And it could be like another one, training records for your employees. That's just one. In HACCP, we used to have 1 or 2 critical control points, so steps at which we'd have to control. Preventive controls, depending on the food product, and again, farms would probably be a little bit more simple, but we've seen 10, 12, 13, 14 different steps at which you have to do monitoring and corrective actions. And each one of them comes with their own detailed set of records that people need to keep. One of the things we encourage as you go through one of our courses is to try to keep your plan as simple as possible. And if it's systematic, you'll have a list of records that are fairly similar for each one of those control measures that you put in place. But it varies from location to location. There are a lot. And again, if you treat it systematically, it sort of makes a lot more sense, and it's a little less daunting. But yeah, to try to say, go to this website and these are the things you have to do, it's really going to be dependent on everybody's distinct operation.
Right.
And we really do encourage going through some type of training for this, where you're able to practice and to kind of come up with some sort of guidance or sort of mock rule program that you develop. And I know when Michelle and I run our program with our other trainers at the University of Florida, we spend a lot of time in breakouts going over those different types of records.
Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. So another question is, if the rule requires food facilities to have this written food safety plan, as we've been discussing, that includes the hazard analysis and preventive controls, as Keith, you've been sort of describing. how often do those need to be reanalyzed? How often do they have to be done?
Oh, yeah, you want to go, Keith?
No, you got it, Michelle.
No, I'm working off of memory,
Okay.
but I think it's
3 years.
annually. It's how often? Every 3 years?
Every 3 years. So HACCP was annually.
Annually.
Where if you were to have a HACCP plan every year, the HACCP team would get together and reanalyze. I believe for preventive controls, it's going to be every 3 years you have to do a complete reanalysis, but it's not always that 3 years. If anything changes within the system, you have to reanalyze. If you have significant deviations, you reanalyze. But it's one of those.
If there's an outbreak in your commodity that is all of a sudden now there's a new hazard that you didn't pick up in your plan, you have to reanalyze. So.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. It's one of those things where they have that scheduled, have to reanalyze, but really one thing that just kind of keep in the back of everybody's brain is that these documents aren't meant to be made and then put on a shelf and get dusty. You want to work with these documents, they're living documents, and anytime you have any hint of things going wrong, you don't want to wait. You want to go in and make sure. If you have any significant changes to the process, if you have a new commodity coming in, you want to reanalyze.
Okay, great. Okay, so on previous podcasts, we have discussed the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, and just a few minutes ago, you both mentioned the preventive controls qualified individual trainings. These are some of the trainings or some of the things that our producers need to be aware of. What is the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance? If you both maybe could, remind us a little bit about what that is and how that is important to, the people, tuning in today.
Yeah, so the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance is a group of individuals coming out of government, industry, and academia who came together to come up with a curricula for a number of different rules under the Food Safety Modernization Act. And so it's housed at the Illinois Institute of Technology up in Chicago, and it's iFish is the name of the group there who's done it, and they have really developed and are modifying now a number of different curricula that train on different FSMA rules, not the produce safety rule, that's the Produce Safety Alliance, but the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance teaches on the preventive control rules for human and animal food, also on foreign supplier verification, which is again the rule I think that we've talked about before, where you're bringing in products internationally. So one of the curricula that they have developed is the training that we've been talking about, our Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance food preventive controls for human foods curricula, and that's the curricula that somebody takes, and it's one way to become that PCQI, that preventive controls qualified individual that every facility needs to have at least one of if they're covered by the rule. Yeah.
And so and that PCQI is a training that they can take. And how long is that training?
So a couple of different ways to take the training. When we offer the training at the University of Florida, we teach it in 3 full days.
Okay.
So I say 3 full days. We say we're going to go through 5 o'clock on the 3rd day. We typically end sometime in the mid-afternoon, but we think nobody likes to leave early, but we don't want to say we're going to be done by noon because everybody gets mad when you make them late. So we've sort of just cut our losses and say that it's a 3-day training, but we do typically get out early. We do that in person, like he said. That is a very hands-on training course where we actually work with groups to work through how to develop these food safety plans and each different step and what the records look like and what the expectation is. You can also take that training online, either in a Zoom remote format, although then you're still looking at what is that, at least 20 hours of online Zoom training. So that tends to be a bit tedious, at least for me. Or you can do something that's called a hybrid option, where you go to a number of pre-recorded lectures and then go in person just to work through the breakouts. And that tends to be about a day in person. Again, depends on your learning modality. The way we teach it with the University of Florida is 3 days in person. We have no desire to move it online at all.
Okay. Yeah, good to know. And another question that we get regularly is, from farmers who said that they have, more than one food safety certification, sometimes many, HACCP, GFSI, SQF, BRC, etc. Do they still need to take the PCQI training if they have other certifications, food safety certification?
This is good. Actually, you had a note in this in the previous slide. Some people can declare themselves a PCQI through just years of experience. It's a little, I don't want to say dangerous, because you really need to know the rule really well. So you could have a lot of experience in HACCP and have no clue how to become or what a PCQI has to do or what the regulation is. If you have 30 years in the industry and you are self-taught, you can kind of self-declare yourself a PCQI, but at that point, you're really going to need to know the ins and outs of the rule itself. So yeah, if you're SQF or British Retail Consortium or any of the alphabet soup we have on the slide right now, yeah, you can sort of self-declare, but for the most part, again, going through one of the training courses is what I would recommend. I think Michelle might agree with me there, but there is that self-declaration that one can make. But for the most part, the vast majority, the folks who are using the moniker of PCQI have gone through some type of FSPCA training to learn the specifics of the preventive controls for human food rule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll follow up with Keith. Like we don't need people in that. We don't want people in that class. We don't need people in that class who don't need to be there. So I think, really make sure that it's applicable for you to be in this training, and you need it. I will say, like Keith, there are advantages to taking the training because it's a little bit of a different way of thinking from the way you think in the other rules. And one of the biggest differences, right, is that your end result is not an audit. It's a preventive controls for human foods inspection. And that inspection mindset is a little bit different, right, than an audit mindset, because the whole process is very different, right? An inspector is not an auditor. They're not working off a list of standardized questions that you've seen before. And so at least in the training that we offer, one of the advantages we have is that typically we train with somebody from FDACS who's out there doing the inspections and is able to offer insight as to what that inspection will look like. Mm-hmm. So do I need to take the training? No, but if it applies to you, we would recommend you do it.
Okay. Yeah, and all the programs you have up there are very similar. I mean, again, they're all basically doing the same thing. There are subtle nuances within each, though, and again, during an inspection, you want to be able to make sure that you have all that language and all the actual requirements for that particular rule, and having a really good understanding for that. So even though they're all covering the same thing, necessary, not always recommended. Yeah, I still think it's good to go through the training at least once.
Right. And so that also maybe perhaps gets to this other question and that a farmer asked us recently, says, do I need to employ a PCQI? And I think you both have sort of answered that question already.
Well, one quick thing, if you don't have to be the PCQI, you can hire one. You can go through a consultant. You can have one of your employees go through the training. Mm-hmm. If you have one of your employees do it, make sure they're going to be sticking around. Because if they decide to take a job somewhere else, you need to get a new PCQI rather quickly. So it's one of those things where if you're relying on just a single individual, I guess make sure they're well paid and they're going to be sticking around. But again, you don't have to be a PCQI yourself. You could hire a qualified consultant who has that training.
Yeah, and again, the only thing I say, do I need to go through the training? If you're covered by the rule, right? And so I'd really make sure there's a reason for you to be in the training.
Um, at the beginning of the webinar today, you mentioned the preventive controls for animal food rule. What are the differences between the preventive control for human food rule and this preventive control for animal food rule?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And in theory, the rules are very similar. In practice, the application of the rules are very different. And so, I think it's important to understand again what is covered under the preventive controls for animal food rule, and they are really looking at controlling pet food and feed. Right? They're not so much worried about somebody dumping culls from a raw agricultural commodity out in a field for cattle or pigs or whatever to eat. They're really worried about production of processed animal feeds, whether it be feed or pet food, and that is really based on a number of outbreaks we've seen recently, right? Linked to animal food and recalls of different pet foods in particular. The PC rule for animal food really spends a long time focusing on those CGMPs that Keith talked about earlier. If you look at feed production, historically, they have not had to adhere to those GMPs that Keith referenced under 110. And so you really, the focus of a lot of the animal food rule focuses on making sure GMPs are in place for animal food. Yeah, Keith, I don't know if you want to build on that.
Yeah, again, I was distressed. It's really for the pet feed and agricultural feed. That's the biggest part. But yeah, that's pretty much the summation of it. Again, that where the preventive rule for human food is preventing humans from getting sick. The animal one is just for trying to keep animals from getting sick. And as Michelle pointed out, there's been a couple of pretty large outbreaks associated with feed, and that's where this rule sort of was why it was developed alongside of the human food one.
And I get Keith and I will also say that we are not the experts at the University of Florida on the animal food rule. We have a colleague named Jason Scheffler over in our animal science department who teaches and runs our animal food courses. And so if you have more questions on that, we'd be glad to if you direct that question to us, we'll very quickly forward it on to Jason, who is great at answering questions about animal feed. Yeah.
Well, Keith and Michelle, I think we have gotten to the end of this webinar and the information that we were hoping to provide to producers. Thank you so much for clarifying so many things. And I know that this is a very complex topic, but you've provided so much really useful information that I encourage all the people tuning in and listening to check out the resources and information that's available to you, because there's, I'm sure, going to be more questions, and we hope that we have at least provided some answers to those questions. You can visit the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act website for more information about this and other topics. There's also resources available at the University of Florida and the Southern Center, which both Keith and Michelle are part of. So please check those out. And of course, you can also visit our website through our Food Safety for Farmers podcast and webinar series. We're providing more information that our expectation is producers can use to understand the food safety regulations and make sure that you are complying with those regulations. We really appreciate the time that you have spent with us, and we thank Keith and Michelle once again for all of the great information they provided and all the support that they have given us throughout these series. Thank you, Keith and Michelle. We really appreciate it, everything that you do.
Thanks, JC.
Always a pleasure.